Mr.
My lady, the next witness is Dame Claire Moriarty.
I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming along to help us, Dame Claire.
Dame Claire, you've produced a witness statement for this module with the number INQ 000652346, which you signed on the 7th of July 2025. Is that statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, it is.
And you're giving evidence today in your capacity as Chief Executive Officer of Citizens Advice?
Yes.
And is it the case that you took up that role in April 2021 and therefore your evidence which relates to the work of Citizens Advice prior to that date is based on documents, data and discussions with your colleagues rather than personal experience?
Yes, that's correct.
Citizens Advice is a national charity which provides advice to the public in England, Wales and the Channel Islands on a wide range of matters, including benefits, debt and employment matters. And it's the umbrella organisation for a large number of Citizens Advice charities who provide advice locally. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And it provides advice to individuals through a mixture of in-person advice, telephone advice and digital provision, which includes advice on its website. And I understand that it provides a particular service which is called Help to Claim. Can you explain to us what the purpose of that service is?
Yes, Help to Claim is a specific service for people making an initial claim for universal credit. It supports people from the point at which they start the claim, so it helps people complete the forms and it will support them through to the point at which they receive a first payment under the universal credit system.
So I'll ask you some questions about the work of Citizens Advice during the pandemic and its engagement with government. And you explain in your statement that the pandemic impacted the ways in which Citizens Advice ordinarily provides advice because it had to move to a remote model during the pandemic rather than providing advice face-to-face. Did that have any impact on the ability of people who were digitally excluded to obtain your advice, for example, in relation to matters such as benefits and debt?
Yes, it did inevitably affect our ability. Before the pandemic, I think around 60% of the one-to-one advice that local Citizens Advice provided was in person. And obviously at the start of the pandemic that went down to zero and all advice was provided by telephone, through web chat, email and other digital means. And that did mean that people who struggled to use, who either didn't have access to digital means or who struggled to use digital access, we knew that they were disadvantaged and tried to get back to means where we could support them as quickly as possible.
And what were the main issues on which advice was sought from Citizens Advice during the pandemic?
Well, there were a huge range of issues on which people sought advice, and they varied over the course of the pandemic. In the early days, there were a lot of people who were seeking assistance on the support that they could get. We tracked the data very in great detail, and we've shared that with the inquiry, so you could see people wanting to know what would happen to their job, what support might be available, whether they could apply for universal credit. We also had lots of inquiries about things like housing, people who were at risk of eviction. So a very broad range of all of the issues that we would normally see, but with additional elements specifically related to the pandemic.
And you explained that Citizens Advice saw a huge increase in the demand for its services, particularly at the outset of the pandemic, and that it received additional funding of £13.5 million from the UK government, and then subsequently a further £5.9 million. Did that money help Citizens Advice to meet that increased demand?
Yes, it did. In in a number of ways. We obviously were having to actually write advice, I know, very quickly, because every time new regulations came out, new guidance came out, new support schemes were made available, we needed to be able to turn that into advice that was accessible to people. So actually just scaling up our ability to write and put online that advice. We also used it to make sure that we could increase our capacity to support people on the phone, and to look at new ways in which we could support people. So we had a number of pilot projects for things like video access to advice. One of our local offices developed a chat bot that would make it easier for people who were accessing advice via the website to get to the right place in the system. The part of the money was also specifically for people needing debt advice.
So you've told us a bit there about the advice which Citizens Advice was providing, but it's also the case that it carried out research during the pandemic to identify gaps in support and issues with economic schemes that the government had put in place. And you explain in your statement that that research drew on two main sources of data. So firstly, your insights from your client data, which is based on cases where you've provided advice to individuals, and also website traffic. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And secondly, there was a poll that Citizens Advice commissioned, which was known internally as the Coronavirus Harms Survey. And did it ask a number of broad, consistent questions across the pandemic in order to allow the impact of the pandemic and economic interventions to be measured?
Yes.
So therefore, you had, as an organisation, data which was relevant to economic need and the impact and gaps in the government's economic interventions. And you go on to say in your statement at paragraph 24 that at the outset of the pandemic, there was greater interest than usual from the Treasury and other government departments and how your data might be best used to inform government decision-making around the pandemic. Can you just expand on that a bit for us? Can you tell us what data the Treasury was interested in, and what was Citizens Advice's understanding as to how it wished to use that data to inform its decision-making?
So I don't have a great deal more detail because obviously I wasn't there at the time, but Citizens Advice was using particularly the data that we had about the pages that people were searching for on the website to be able to say these are issues which are of concern. We were also using data from people coming to us to understand, for example, we had a lot of people who were concerned that they were not being furloughed by their employer when they might have been. So we built up a picture of the circumstances of people. Again, data on housing, and I think one of your other witnesses referred to data that they'd received from Citizens Advice, which they then shared with colleagues in the Treasury. So we were trying to make sure that as much as possible of what we understood about the circumstances that people were experiencing was being shared with the Treasury. And as I understand it from people who were there at the time, for a period, there was quite a lot of interest, and people would be asking, did we have data on particular issues? We didn't have visibility of what then happened to the data and whether it influenced any of the decisions being taken.
You go on to say in your statement that the Treasury's interest in the data which your organisation held was not sustained as the pandemic continued. Is that the case?
That's my understanding, that there was an initial lots of interest, but then as people became preoccupied with other issues, we found it a bit harder to get traction with our data.
You also say that a key element of Citizens Advice's work is advocating to government decision makers about policy changes that might address root causes of people's issues, using your frontline insights and the policy research that you've carried out. During the pandemic, what areas did Citizens Advice focus on in terms of seeking to influence government policy, and why did it choose to focus on those areas?
I think it's set out in the evidence, but we were particularly focused on the experience of people who were coming to us So issues to do with universal credit, issues to do with people's experience of the coronavirus job retention scheme, issues to do with housing. There were some particular issues when I look back at the range of outputs that we produced during that time. Things like the 5-week wait for people moving on to universal credit. There were some very strong themes that we consistently returned to.
Thank you. And we'll come on to deal with the 5-week wait shortly. You also say in your statement that there was no formal consultation that took place between Citizens Advice and the government in relation to its economic interventions. What benefit do you think that consultation would have had for the economic response?
Well, I think if you go back to that, the amazingly rich picture that Citizens Advice had and has of people's experience, just by virtue of the number of people who are coming to us and the depth with which we explore their issues, we could probably have provided insights into what might work, what might not work, and particularly as schemes were put in place and then over time they benefited from being adjusted in various ways. As soon as a scheme came in, we would start to see how that was playing out in practice, and those insights could have made sure that the schemes were developed in the best way.
I want to ask you about a particular paper that you say in your statement that you shared with the government, and it's entitled Helping People Through the COVID-19 Pandemic. You say at paragraph 36 that it shared that paper with the government. Is that the UK government that you're referring to there? Do you know?
That would have been the UK government, yes.
And can you tell us what the analysis in that paper showed with regards to the groups that you said would be particularly vulnerable to the economic effects of the pandemic?
Yes. So my recollection is that was a paper that was written quite early on in the pandemic, before some of the support schemes were put in place, and so some of the issues that it raised were kind of overtaken. But the particular groups that we pulled out were people in low-paid employment, so people who earn below the lower earnings limit, which was at the time necessary to earn statutory sickness pay, although my recollection is that was something which was addressed quite early on by the government, particularly self-employed people who didn't have enough contributions to benefit from employment and support allowance, a lot of people who were just in very low financial resilience, who we knew from the data we gathered that they didn't have enough savings to cover their outgoings for a week or so if they suddenly lost their source of income. And then we also highlighted people whose costs, for example, particularly their energy costs, would rise if they suddenly had to stay at home and self-isolate, and therefore be paying more for energy.
So I just want to ask you some questions now about some of those particular groups that you've mentioned. Firstly, low-paid workers. Did low-paid workers and those who were on 0 hours contracts face particular challenges in terms of their finances despite the economic support which was made available to them?
Yes, they did. So if I take the two groups in turn, because the issues are slightly different. So I think particularly for low-paid workers, even if they were put on furlough was paid at 80% of people's wages. A reduction of 20% if you are a high earner is not, it is not impossible to manage, and particularly in an environment where many of the things that people normally spent their discretionary income were not available to them, like nights out and holidays. Whereas for people on low-paid workers, the margin that they have between their absolutely essential costs and their total income is very small, and often that would be less than the 20% that they would lose. So there were people for whom, even if they were on furlough, losing that 20% of income just pushed them to a point where they didn't have enough to manage on. We know that a lot of people who were in low-paid work, and particularly moving on to the insecure workers, people who didn't have access to furlough, people on 0 hours contracts. A higher proportion of them than overall employed people were furloughed, but we saw that they suffered a greater loss of income, were more likely to find themselves in debt, and often just had fewer resources to fall back on.
I just want to pick up on one of the things you mentioned there about the furlough scheme and the 80%. You say in your statement, paragraph 114, that any future furlough scheme ought to consider whether a flat wage replacement rate is the right solution to protect those at risk of falling into severe hardship, particularly those in low-paid work. And I just wondered what policy design you consider would be more effective to protect low-paid workers in any future pandemic.
Well, I mean, there's various things that one could consider. One would be, to set the furlough percentage at a higher level for people on low pay, so that if you had that kind of support scheme, it's actually covering the whole of people's income. If their income is already at the point where they are, barely able to make ends meet, reducing that income is much more problematic. Or having some kind of thinking about what is a sort of minimum income level that for people to survive on. That's obviously to some extent what the benefit system is intended to do, but we know from our work during the pandemic and subsequently that a large number of people really struggle to make ends meet on the standard level of benefits.
But isn't that a different point? And if your policy objective with furlough is to maintain the link between employers and employees and all the other policy objectives we've heard about, your policy objective of the welfare system is separate. That's individual support. That's to support income. So surely on that argument, you should be looking at improving the benefits rather than improving the furlough system, because they've got different policy objectives, haven't they?
They have, and I think we would certainly say that there is a need to improve the benefit system. And I think one of the very difficult things about these support schemes was that there was an inevitable interaction between the furlough scheme and the benefit system, because many people would have received some element of support from both of them, and exactly as you say, they had different objectives.
I want to ask you now about people who were self-employed and the support that was available to them. The inquiries heard during its listening exercise, Every Story Matters, that cliff edges in the self-employment income support scheme caused some difficulty for individuals, with one contributor stating, "I think a fairer system of self-employment support that was not a cliff edge would have dramatically reduced the worry and upset to me." Did Citizens Advice have any concerns about cliff edges and support in the self-employment scheme?
We did, yes. I mean, there were a number of cliff edges within the self-employed income support scheme, one of which related to profits at £50,000. Now, the nature of the people coming to us for help is that was a known cliff edge, but it was less visible. The one that we were very clear was an issue of people who had newly become self-employed and who therefore didn't have they hadn't had income from self-employment in 2018, 2019. They therefore didn't have a tax return completed by the time they at the start of the pandemic. So anyone who had become self-employed later than April 2019 didn't receive any benefit from the self-employed income support scheme, and that was I think we estimated there were 400,000 people who were affected by that, who therefore couldn't claim from that scheme, and the only scheme available to them was universal credit, and some of them then couldn't claim universal credit because their level of savings was too high, which in some cases was simply a level of savings which was there to make sure they could pay their tax bill when it fell due. But there were certainly people who, the cliff edges caused people to fall down the cracks with very serious consequences for them.
And we've heard some evidence this morning that data issues and concerns about the risk of fraud meant that the inclusion of that group in the scheme didn't happen. Was one solution which was proposed by Citizens Advice the possibility of enabling grants to be backdated for people who had become self-employed in that recent financial year if they submitted a tax return immediately after the financial year ended?
Yes, I mean, we saw that as the reason for ruling them out appeared to be that they hadn't yet submitted a tax return for the 2019-2020 tax year, and the last date for submitting such a tax return wasn't until January 2021. But there is nothing to stop people submitting a tax return as soon as the end of the tax year to which it relates. So it seemed I think, to Citizens Advice at the time, an obvious thing to do to say, well, once you do submit a tax return, then you become eligible to the scheme, and the scheme can then be backdated to the start of the financial year.
And was that change implemented?
Not as far as I know. I think in the later rounds of the self-employed income support scheme that went right into 2021, there were some changes in relation to the newly self-employed. But I think that particular cohort of people by that time would have, in any case, submitted a tax return. So it may have been doing no more than catching up with reality.
Another group which you explained in your statement was disproportionately economically impacted by the pandemic was people with no recourse to public funds. And that's people with a visa condition, which means they're not entitled to financial assistance from the state, such as benefits. What was the economic impact of the pandemic on that group?
So it was a particularly bad impact for that group. They were able to be furloughed, but there was about a 3-week period when it wasn't clear whether they would be able to be furloughed. So quite a lot of people left their jobs during that period. They did have access to furlough and to statutory sick pay because those are contributory. They had access to contributory benefits, but they didn't have access to universal credit. So essentially, it meant that the safety net element of the welfare system wasn't available to them. So, for example, we know that there were quite a lot of people who were made redundant when they could have been furloughed. So if you were made redundant and you had the NRPF visa condition, you couldn't apply for universal credit. If you were working and your hours were reduced, so you couldn't be furloughed because you were still working, but you were working fewer hours, receiving less money, and for many people they could then apply for universal credit and have some part of that income available. So that bit of the safety net was unavailable, and when people couldn't, if somebody was shielding because they were clinically extremely vulnerable, if they couldn't work and their employer said, but I want you to work, they had a choice of either coming into work and putting themselves and potentially other people at risk, or not coming into work, receiving no income and having nowhere else to go. So they were a group that was hugely impacted, and we saw that over quite a long period in terms of people's, the level of debt that people were in, the amount of income that they lost, and people's inability then to get back into full-time work.
Yes, and Citizens Advice actually wrote to UK government ministers in June 2020 to recommend that the no recourse to public funds restriction should be temporarily suspended. Is that right?
That is right, yes.
Why was it thought that that was the appropriate approach that the government should put in place?
Well, I think in that letter to the Home Secretary, I think we asked for a number of things. One was for the restrictions associated with that visa condition to be lifted, so that people could access, the safety net at a time when it was particularly needed. There were other issues, people's ability to request leave to remain for their spouses was dependent on meeting a minimum income threshold, and somebody who'd come to this country who was meeting that income threshold but saw their income fall because of the pandemic then found that they didn't meet that condition, and it also had there's also income elements that affect the amount of time that people have to wait before they can have settled status, which again we were arguing that shouldn't be extended just because people had lost income during the pandemic. So there was a collection of things where we could see through the people coming to us the impact that the pandemic was having, and we were, again, using those insights, seeking to persuade the government to make changes that would avoid people's lives being so badly affected.
And is that an approach that Citizens Advice would advocate that a government in a future economic emergency puts in place to support this group?
I think, this is a group who are, they are disproportionately affected by a lot of things. They are also highly represented in sectors like health and care, which are actually absolutely critical to a pandemic. So, it makes sense from every point of view to ensure that they are properly supported. So having arrangements in place in any future pandemic or similar crisis would be really important.
So I want to ask you now some questions about issues relating to universal credit claims during the pandemic. And you say in your statement that Citizens Advice supported the uplift which was made to universal credit. What did Citizens Advice understand the purpose of the uplift to be?
So, to the best of my knowledge, we simply understood it to be, a recognition of the fact that people were under financial pressure, and it was bringing universal credit, up to a level which people could actually were closer to being able to live on. I mean, I now know from having followed some of the other evidence that's been given to this inquiry that there was quite a lot of debate about who it should be, who the DWP would have liked it to be supporting, and whether there were other people who benefited, because for operational reasons you couldn't target it. But I think at the time, none of that was visible to Citizens Advice. We simply, understood that the government had decided to uplift universal credit.
And the inquiry heard evidence last week that in the weeks around the first lockdown there was a surge in universal credit claims, and you've also explained that Citizens Advice experienced an increase in demand for its advice around universal credit at that time. You say at paragraph 63 that it shared headline analysis of issues which its clients were facing with universal credit at the start of the pandemic directly with government stakeholders in April 2020. And if we could have that analysis on the screen, it's INQ. Great, thank you. And this is the paper here. Do you know if that paper was shared with the Department for Work and Pensions?
I don't know directly, but I would be very surprised if it hadn't been in some form or other.
So if we could turn to page 2, we can see there a list of the top 10 issues which clients making an initial claim for universal credit needed help with between the end of March and the start of April 2020. And eligibility is the top issue on that list. Can you explain what those eligibility issues related to?
To be honest, there is not a great deal I can add, not having been around at the time, but it will have, the issues generally that relate to universal credit will be things like whether people have got savings at a level that are too high, and their overall level of income, because there is a tapering process that if your income is between two different levels, the amount of universal credit you receive reduces gradually, and then you become ineligible. So there will have been questions to do with people's income level, their savings level, and then I imagine also the no recourse to public funds issues as well.
We can also see that the 8th issue on that list is access to internet digital literacy. What difficulties did people trying to make a universal credit claim encounter during the pandemic as a result of a lack of digital access?
Well, I imagine that it will have been, the main route for claiming universal credit will have been a digital route, because I think job centres were mostly closed at the start of the pandemic, and so there is an online process for application. Almost by definition, if people were coming through to us, they have therefore found a telephone route that would help them complete their claims, but certainly needing to be able to get online, have a reliable connection, and to be able to manage the process of digital application we know in 2025 as well as 2020 is quite an issue for some people needing to claim universal credit.
Do you think that there was adequate support in place during the pandemic for people that needed that support?
Well, the help to claim service. That's what it's there for. It is there to provide people with a route to claim, make their claim for universal credit, which doesn't rely on being able to do everything themselves. I think in normal times people do go to job centres, and a job centre will provide will help somebody with an initial application. Although there's a question of ongoing management, but the ability of people to deal with digital people who were not used to dealing with things digitally suddenly to be in a world where it's much harder to operate. That's an area that would need thinking about in any future occasion to make sure there is enough support.
Do you think there's anything that could be done at this point to ensure that support is in place for a future emergency?
Well, proper funding of the right kind of advice, so making sure that advice is available in a variety of different channels. There's some support which is available, face to face, and at the time, the help to claim service, bar the pandemic, the help to claim service was available to people both face to face and over the phone. When it was recommissioned in a slightly different form, it then became a telephone and digital only service. So that whole question of how you make services available to people, and particularly for people who really struggle with anything other than face to face. That is a broader issue in relation to advice provision.
Thank you. We can see that the third and fourth issues on that list there relate to advance payments and the initial wait for payment. Did Citizens Advice see any evidence of people encountering financial difficulties as a result of the 5-week wait for the first payment during the pandemic?
Yes, huge amount.
Citizens Advice wrote to the Chancellor on the 9th of March 2020 and also to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury on the 6th of May 2020. And if we could have that letter on the screen from May 2020, and it's INQ 000641803. Could you just tell us a bit about what those difficulties were that people were encountering?
So the consequence of the 5-week wait is that people who are starting a claim for universal credit don't receive any income for the first 5 weeks. It is a very fundamental design element of universal credit, and it relies on the fact that people have enough, they either have a final pay packet or they have enough savings to be able to sustain themselves for that 5 weeks until they get a first payment for universal credit. But we know from huge numbers of people coming to us that for many people that just isn't the case. And they struggle to be able to, just meet their basic day-to-day costs until they receive a first payment. The government's response tends to be that you can apply for an advance payment. And certainly, that was generally the response during the pandemic when we and others raised the issue of the 5-week wait, was that people can apply for an advance payment. The problem with an advance payment is that it is then recovered through deductions from people's subsequent universal credit payments over a period of months until it's all been paid back. And the universal credit standard allowance is set at a rate which will allow you to buy food. It won't allow you to, broadly speaking, buy a new pair of shoes, because it's not designed to do that. And if you then are taking a chunk of that money out every month to repay the advance loan, then very quickly it just forms another thing that's driving people into debt. Or they can't make their budgets add up. Some people are so worried, and we certainly had examples of people who were so worried about getting into debt that they didn't want to take out the advance payment, so they would absolutely pare things back to the bone in order not to have to take out an advance payment. But it is a huge problem, and throughout the pandemic, in this letter, but in many other research outputs that we put out, we were calling for those loans to be replaced by grants, so that people would, I think, from a kind of administration of the social security system point of view, it would be the same process of you would give people the money. There is the ability to upfront the money. It would just mean that was a grant, and therefore the repayments weren't put into the system.
Yes, and if we can see from this letter here to Steve Barclay, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, if we go to page 2, that is in fact what Citizens Advice suggests, that the advance payment is made in the form of a grant rather than a loan. Was there something specific to the circumstances of the pandemic that meant Citizens Advice thought it was important that it should be provided in the form of a grant?
Well, people's, the debate about the 5-week wait goes on, and whether or not giving people a loan and immediately, as soon as they start having a universal credit claim, immediately taking a bite out of that to repay a loan, that's an issue which we continue to press on to the present day. But I think the particular circumstances of the pandemic was people's ability to flex anything in their lives was very, very limited. So there was no capacity to do a little bit more work. There was very little capacity for people to change any of their circumstances. They couldn't. People were essentially just surviving in very small spaces. So and their ability, not just in those 5 weeks, but over the succeeding months, to be able to change any of their circumstances was so limited that it felt as if it was you could do as a contained measure that wouldn't necessarily carry all the precedent risk of, well, now we've done that, we can't go back. To have for that period, to have the advance payments as grants rather than loans where people needed them would have made a huge difference.
We also heard evidence last week that, unlike universal credit, legacy benefits were not uplifted during the pandemic. And Citizens Advice published a paper in May 2020, thank you, we can bring that letter down now, where it identified a number of changes which it said should be made to the benefits system during the pandemic, which included a recommendation that legacy benefits should be uplifted. Why did Citizens Advice believe that people on legacy benefits should also receive that uplift?
Well, the costs that people were experiencing, there were material additional costs that we saw people experiencing during the pandemic. Energy, because people were staying at home more. Telecommunications, because so much of people's lives had to be lived online. Housing costs just went up. And so people had a lot of additional costs. Those costs were not confined to people who were on universal credit, people who were on legacy benefits, who I think on average were more likely to be disabled, and for whom those costs were often higher and their circumstances were worse. There was no logical reason in what we understood of the purpose of the £20 uplift, why you would uplift, why you would give some additional money to people on universal credit and not to people on legacy benefits.
Thank you. Just some questions now about the end of the uplift. In the experience of Citizens Advice, how important is it for people claiming benefits to receive sufficient notice of any changes to the amount of benefits that they will receive in order to assist with financial planning?
It's very important that people have enough time. I think in this case, the impact of the £20 uplift was, hugely beneficial for people. You could see how that showed up in, a smaller number of people with what we call negative budgets, where their income doesn't meet their essential outgoings, lower demand for food banks. So notice was helpful, but actually what would have been much more helpful would have been to not to lose the uplift in the first place.
Did Citizens Advice have a view on whether sufficient notice was given of the extension, the 6-month extension of the uplift, or indeed the end of the uplift to claimants?
I don't think we had it's not something that I've found a lot of evidence of. I think there was quite a lot of notice of the end of the uplift. There was also, a very concerted campaign by a range of organisations, including ourselves, and we hoped that we might be able to reverse the decision to end the uplift. But I think I don't think there was a. Certainly for the actual end of it, there was quite a lot of notice. To be honest, I can't remember what the timeline was for the extension.
So you've told us that Citizens Advice obviously wanted the uplift to become a permanent feature, but notwithstanding that, did it have any concerns about the timing of the end of the uplift in October 2021?
We were very concerned about the impact that it was going to have on people's finances. I think we did some research, and 38% of people on universal credit did not have the slack in their budget to be able to absorb the loss of the uplift, and we were by that time we were starting to see the energy prices rising. So energy prices started there. There was quite a big jump in the energy price cap in October 2021. We were starting to see energy companies failing and having to be absorbed by other companies. So the straws in the wind of what turned out to be a very, very challenging 2022 were already there at the time. So it felt like a particularly difficult point to be withdrawing the uplift. But, to be honest, to withdraw it at any time would have been very problematic.
Finally, in your statement, you set out some recommendations as to how the economic response in a future emergency might be improved. And I just want to ask you about a few of them. Firstly, you propose that a clear protocol for how the government will communicate with and harness the voluntary and charitable sector in future pandemics should be established. Why do you think that's necessary, and how do you think it would assist any future economic response?
So, just looking at it from the perspective of Citizens Advice, I think, we had very, very good data, and as we've talked about in the early, there was a brief period when there was a lot of interest in it, but our data could have beneficially informed the various iterations over time of the support schemes that the government put in place, and we could indeed, because we were in touch with so many people, we could have used our channels to find out a lot more about what was happening to people's financial circumstances if the government had come to us and said, could you just ask these questions of people coming to you for help? So I think that's one area. We were, as you said at the start, we were running the Help to Claim service, and I know one of your other witnesses has said, well, could that not have been used as a means to get information out to people? And I think the answer is yes, it certainly could have done, but the focus was on managing that as a contract, or performance managing a grant agreement. So I think the integration, thinking completely across the system about how the knowledge and the insights that the voluntary sector has, or Citizens Advice specifically has, the channels that we have to put people out, to put things out to people. We're also, we are a source of advice for the country. The government very, very regularly and very properly signposts people to Citizens Advice. But we weren't getting information any more quickly than the public. So we would find out that, you know, a piece of guidance had gone out, or a new support scheme was available, or the rules had been changed, you know, from the news the same way that other people did, which meant that we were always a few days behind in terms of how we could update our advice. And I think, you know, one of my reflections is that if the government had felt able to, you know, trust an organisation like Citizens Advice and help us, you know, bring us into the thinking, you know, even 24 hours, 48 hours earlier, we could have been better able to help the government in turn support people in, you know, navigating and accessing systems.
Thank you. We heard some evidence yesterday about the existence of a civil society covenant. Is that something you're aware of? And if so, do you think that it might provide an appropriate framework for the sort of engagement during a pandemic that you're proposing?
I am aware of the Civil Society Covenant. I think it is very well-meaning, but the reality is, I mean, it's all about what you do and not what you say. And I think what we haven't yet seen is the covenant moving from being some very well-intentioned statements to a real sense of engagement. Government doesn't engage with civil society with anything like the regularity that it does with the business sector, and particularly economic departments. There was a piece of research done by an organisation recently which showed that, you know, of ministerial and senior official contact with the 6 big economic departments, I think roughly, don't have the exact figures, but it was something like 80% of it is with business and 6% of it is with civil society. Civil society is, you know, has so much potential because we are in touch with people. We see the problems, we understand the problems, but there is a tendency to want civil society to sometimes be a broadcast messenger. So, you know, when government thinks about resilience, it wants to work with the voluntary sector, but mainly to say, can you now tell people X? You know, whereas it needs to be a much, much more integrated process. And I think the jury is still out on whether or not the Civil Society Covenant is going to deliver that.
On the topic of data, you suggest that improved data matching between government departments would help economic support to be better targeted in a future economic response. Can you just elaborate on what you mean by that and how you think it would be beneficial?
Yes. So one of the things that government has great difficulty doing is targeting people. And we saw that, I mean, I think we probably saw that during COVID, but we've seen it also more recently with things like cost of living support, where, you know, it's possible to do measures for the whole of the population, and it's possible to target things onto people who are in receipt of means-tested benefits because the government has all of their details. It's really difficult to target groups which are larger than means-tested benefits or different to means-tested benefits, but smaller than the entire population. And the way to do it is by matching the data that HMRC holds about people's income with data that, for example, you know, DWP holds, or, you know, the Department of Energy Security, Net Zero, holds. That is something which government finds difficult, but the ability to make sure that the right support gets to people. So, for example, you know, how do you get the right energy support to people? You do need to join up data from different sources, and then be able to proactively target people, make sure they're aware of what they might be entitled to, how they might be helped.
Thank you. My lady, those are my questions.
Thank you very much, Stephen Stewart. I don't think there are any other questions. Thank you very much indeed. I'm really grateful to you. Very enlightening, and obviously the CAB have a lot of experience and information to share. So thank you for all that you and your colleagues did to try and help people during such a difficult time, and for your help with the inquiry.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's right.
Yes, my lady. The next witness is Steve Barclay.
please.
Okay. If you'd like to take the Bible in your right hand
Okay.
and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming back to help, Mr. Barclay. I hope we haven't kept you waiting too long.
Not at all.
Mr. Barclay, you've provided two statements to the inquiry. I'm just going to give the reference numbers, which are INQ 00659744 and then INQ 00659745. And your statements, one of them in particular, is focused, or both of them focused on your time as Chief Secretary to the Treasury, but one of them on funding issues and including funding issues as between the UK government and the devolved administrations. And that's the focus of my questioning of you this afternoon. Just by way of general background, and so we can understand, in ordinary times, there are a number of different mechanisms by which the devolved administrations can receive or raise funds of their own volition. Is that right?
That's correct.
There is taxation, so devolved administrations possess some tax-raising powers, but you wouldn't normally think about taxation as a means of raising emergency funding in a time of crisis, would you?
Correct.
Yeah, okay. Borrowing, there is some limited borrowing power, as the inquiry understands it. Is that right?
It varies between the DAs, but they have borrowing options, yes.
Yeah. And they can borrow either for capital expenditure or for resource borrowing, is that right?
Correct.
Scotland and Wales have a reserve, albeit that is in a restricted amount. Is that right? As an emergency reserve, effectively?
That's also correct, yeah.
Yeah, okay. And then there is also, is this right, the United Kingdom reserve, so an emergency UK-wide reserve. Is that effectively a reserve of last resort?
It's for UK-wide issues, yes.
Okay. But can the devolved administrations make a claim on the UK reserve, to your knowledge?
Well, they can make requests to the UK government, but that would be looked at on a UK-wide basis.
Okay. And the by far the largest source of funding in terms of budgets, the block grant and Barnett formula consequentials, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. On the UK reserve, just before we move on, did any of the devolved administrations make a claim on the UK reserve, to your knowledge, during the pandemic?
There was a whole range of discussions at official level in terms of how the UK government could work very constructively with devolved administrations. I couldn't second guess every nature of that discussion, but it was, I think, reported by all parties that it was very constructive in their engagement. I think that is reflected, my lady, in the witness statements that we've had. And within that, it was looking at what the levels of support could be.
Yeah. But were you aware of a successful claim by any devolved administration on the UK reserve?
I think before they would do that, they would probably use their own borrowing and reserve powers, and I don't think they had done so, so they would do that before they would come to the UK.
Understood. Thank you. So, in terms of the block grant and consequentials, funding is allocated. And is this the position that where further emergency funding is allocated to England, an additional proportion is provided to the devolved administrations by way of the Barnett consequential formula?
Well, that is in terms of where funding is provided for things that are reserved. So if money goes to an English department in terms of English spending, then the Barnett consequential would be paid in respect of that amount for the devolved administrations.
So is it right that the level of consequential funding is contingent on the funding in England?
Largely, that is what it's shaped by, yeah. Not entirely, but that is largely what it's shaped by.
And if there was no funding decision for England, would that result in no consequential funding to the devolved administrations? So one follows the other, or is that not always the case?
No, because some funding is UK-wide, and also some funding is dealt with specifically, such as AMI funding, which is separate to the Barnett consequentials. So one can't just say that if there wasn't Barnett consequentials, there would be no financial support for the DAs.
Now, I'd like to focus on why, really, emergency funding arrangements were required for the devolved administrations during the pandemic. It was one of the issues that arose around concerns that the devolved administrations had about the uncertainty in their levels of funding at the outset of the pandemic?
But I think that was common to all parts of the UK government, so English departments and the devolved administrations.
Yeah. So did the devolved administrations in particular raise with you concerns about the certainty of their funding? I'm trying to concentrate on them, not the situation in England. And was that because they didn't really know the size of, if you like, the pot of money they'd get until funding was announced or decided by the UK government?
Well, first and foremost, I think no one knew the full size of the risks. Obviously, the pandemic was evolving at huge pace, and the level of health interventions was unclear. And as a consequence, the level of financial intervention was also unclear.
Do you agree as a general proposition that the longer it's left for the UK government to announce its spending plans, the harder it is for the devolved administrations to know about the size of the pot that they're going to receive, and for the Treasury and the devolved administrations, therefore, to plan accordingly?
I think it depends on which risk. So if you're, my lady, when I last gave evidence, we spoke about the very rapid increase in Department of Health funding from 100 million to over 15 billion in a matter of just, I think, 5 or 6 weeks from late March to early May. Now, that funding would then be for procurement, for example, on things that were UK-wide. And obviously, it wouldn't be logical for all the DAs to compete with each other to procure certain areas. It made sense to do some of that collectively. But within the question, it is also the case that where there was money to an English department, there was a risk of a delay for the DAs in terms of knowing what the final agreement with that department was, vis-a-vis what their money would be available from Barnett consequentials. And that's why, as we may come on to, we agreed a guarantee in the summer.
And so we will indeed come on to the guarantee, but before that, do you accept that there was therefore a difficulty for the devolved administrations in terms of their planning expenditure and therefore response?
Well, I think firstly, that difficulty was probably less than it was for English departments.
Would you just pick up and explain that?
Well, the reason being is, firstly, the starting point as a result of the Barnett formula was more advantageous to the devolved administration. So the block grant gave Scotland 129%, Wales 121%, and Northern Ireland 129% funding compared to England. So for each £100 allocated to an English department, Scotland would get £129. That beneficial had increased since 2010. There are various things that shape that, such as population growth, which was higher in England, so it was again more beneficial to the devolved administrations. And then there's other factors. So, for example, if I take Northern Ireland, my lady, the Confidence and Supply Agreement had allocated additional funding to Northern Ireland on top of the advantageous Barnett funding. And I think that took them up from memory to 137%. So they had £137 for each £100 in England. So there was a better starting point in the devolved administrations than would have been the case for English departments grappling with the same uncertainty that DA colleagues were grappling with.
So a better starting point in cash per head of population, essentially.
Yes.
Because is that the point you were making about the population in England having changed, that there's therefore a lower amount per head in England than there was in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland?
Well, the formula was more generous to start with. I think again, academic research had suggested the truer assessment of Scotland's need was around 5%. So the starting point was more generous. But what I think it's also very fair to say is the devolved administrations were grappling with the same uncertainty that English departments were also grappling with.
Same uncertainty, but a better starting point from which to manage that uncertainty. Is
Yes.
that right? I understand. So accepting that there was uncertainty, did you and the Treasury consider how you could manage and minimise that uncertainty with the devolved governments and their funding?
We did.
And what did you consider as the range of options that would have been potentially available to manage that?
Well, firstly, as ministers, we gave very clear steer for there to be very close engagement at official level. And again, I think the witness statements bear out, particularly in the early months, that there was very good engagement. And within that, all variations carried risks, but we looked at what were the ways of giving more certainty to the devolved administrations so that they could make decisions before having to wait for a final funding settlement with an English department.
Now, there are a number of different ways in which you could have offered certainty. Can I just ask about one option that I think the devolved administrations were very keen on, which was that you granted them an increase in their borrowing powers? That was certainly a suggestion that was coming from the devolved administrations. Is that right?
It was. I think the point is that the UK government can borrow more quickly and more cheaply. It also has the expertise in terms of that borrowing, so it would have meant changing the mechanism at very short notice. And also the UK government bore many other risks associated with that borrowing. So, for example, VAT, National Insurance Corporation tax, would sit with the UK government. So it was both more prudent for the UK government to make that borrowing from a scale, efficiency and an expertise point of view, but it also better reflected where the incentives lay around that borrowing.
So you considered it as an option, but effectively rejected it as a policy option for those reasons. Is that
on
that
advice from Treasury officials,
Yeah.
which I agreed with.
Of course, but you were ultimately one of the decision makers.
Indeed.
Yeah. Okay. And was this a factor that you also wanted to provide or manage uncertainty and minimise it where you could, but against the background of the pre-existing funding arrangement? In other words, not to make long-term changes to that funding arrangement. This was about emergency funding and managing risk in that emergency.
Well, again, at a time of huge uncertainty and a desire for pace, there was a logic in using existing mechanisms where they had a degree of flexibility and where the starting point of those existing practices were not disadvantageous to the devolved administrations.
Right. And was it from those objectives that the Barnett Guarantee emerged as an option?
It emerged not least at the request of the devolved administration. So you will have seen, for example, in Rebecca Evans's evidence that she wrote to me requesting that a guarantee be given. We were working very constructively with the DAs, and in part that was something they had requested. We could see the challenge in terms of uncertainty whilst final decisions were taken with English departments, and therefore there was a benefit in giving that certainty so that the DAs could press ahead with some of the decisions they themselves needed to take.
So it was something that the devolved administrations themselves were seeking.
Yes.
And it was something that you thought managed the risk and uncertainty, minimised it as far as you could.
Correct.
Okay. And could you just explain in simple terms how that Barnett Guarantee worked, what it was intended to do, how it operated?
It worked really by anticipating the trajectory of spend. So we could see, not least in the discussions that we were already taking with English departments, that it was likely we would allocate funding to those departments for the pressures they faced, but we were still discussing precisely what the level of that funding needed to be. And so there would be data being passed between the departments, discussions being had between respected officials to try and quantify what impact there would be on DCMS from sports grounds being closed, for example. Whilst working that out, we wanted the Scottish Government, the Welsh Government, the Northern Ireland Assembly to be able to make decisions without the fear that if they committed spending and then we decided a lower quantum with an English department, that money would be recalled or part of that money recalled. And so what it did was anticipate it was likely the trajectory was going to continue. As a result, let's give some early confidence to the DAs. And the fact that that was then adjusted upwards 3 times shows why we had confidence that the trajectory was on an upward track.
So it provides a level of certainty about funding that, as you say, enables the devolved administrations to make decisions and to plan on that basis that they have that certainty.
Correct.
Okay. And that was the policy approach that you took. Was it welcomed by the devolved administrations so far as you were concerned?
It was.
Okay. And as you said, the guarantee was uplifted, I think, on 3 occasions in total. 9th of October 2020 to 14 billion, 16 billion on the 5th of November 2020, and 16.8 billion on the 24th of December 2020. So it went up by those increments on those dates. The pandemic, as it affected the United Kingdom, generally speaking, it had an even distribution throughout the United Kingdom. Do you think that the mechanism, looking ahead you saw how it operated, how do you think the mechanism would sit in a pandemic that didn't affect the United Kingdom or parts of it equally? So an asymmetric pandemic.
I think it's a much more complex question because it goes to the nature which we may come on to around information sharing and quality of data, how much one wants to determine from a UK government level and how much one wants to devolve. But it opens many similar questions to as would apply to, for example, the Mayor of Manchester or the Mayor of Birmingham. And I think one of the political questions in the discussion between, and it's been going on for 30, 40 years, the discussion between a Barnett formula and a more needs-based UK-wide allocation is firstly, how is one fair across the United Kingdom, including to England? And second, as the last week's budget coverage has shown, people's assessment of need varies greatly. So if I just take Scotland as an example, it might be, people would say in Scotland that the needs of Glasgow and an inner city area are particularly acute. But I suspect if one was talking to members of Parliament from the Highlands of Scotland, they would say their needs are particularly acute because of low density and services are very stretched. And so it's quite difficult as a political question to look at the needs-based. What we were dealing with during the COVID pandemic was something that largely was symmetrical across the UK, and I'm sure we may again come on to second and third waves, but actually it was something that tended to hit more across the United Kingdom as a whole.
So taking that into account and the points you've just made, generally speaking, in time of a future emergency, it not being known how that emergency will develop and whether it will affect the United Kingdom equally or not, would you be in favour of there being fixed principles for emergency funding that are predetermined, or do you favour an ad hoc approach that can be formulated depending on the nature of the emergency that's being faced?
I think, generally speaking, it's quite difficult to write the formula that anticipates the precise nature of a future crisis in one in which there will be a commonality of view of what the needs respectively are. And therefore, schemes that allow a degree of flexibility and discretion often are more effective. So to give you an example, one of the things we found actually worked rather better with local authorities was where we gave a discretionary fund for them to allocate locally based on local need. When we tried to allocate for a set purpose, then you would find one area saying that they either had that issue in greater abundance or another area feeling that they had been left out unfairly when they should have had support for something else which was acute to them. And so it's quite hard from the centre sometimes to be overly prescriptive.
Yeah. So a fixed set of quantitative rules then that are determined from the centre may not be the answer, rather than looking at the nature of the emergency and then developing policy accordingly, is that?
Well, we have some rules. There is, for example, a Scotland fiscal framework. And indeed, there were some amendments made after my time in the Treasury on that. So there are principles and some rules already in place. What I'm saying is, in an environment where A, data is always a challenge, and B, even with perfect data, people's interpretation of that data will vary, it's quite hard to anticipate a future crisis and write the precise formula for that.
Do you have any view? I asked you some questions about borrowing and borrowing flexibility. Do you have any view, looking ahead, this is, as to whether there ought to at least be the option of borrowing flexibility or more borrowing flexibility for the devolved administrations in an emergency situation?
I think it's about balance. So where there should be flexibility, one needs to ensure that the incentives are aligned. If the cost of the flexibility is borne by the UK government, but the benefit is borne by the devolved administration, then I think that creates a tension. So I think the question then is, how can you align with greater flexibility the liability for any decisions that are taken?
Can I just ask you to give your observations about an amendment or an adjustment potentially to the Barnett guarantee sort of mechanism, which would be to actually reduce the size of the guarantee to a lower notional figure until the full sums had been calculated. So there's a set lower figure, rather than have even then the process of having to calculate the amount.
So can you clarify that we should have allocated less?
Yes, so as an alternative mechanism in the future to have a lower level of certainty, with the option then to calculate precise figures later. So reducing the.
I think the risk, and obviously it's not for me to speculate on what other witnesses would say, but I fear the Treasury would be criticised for restricting the public health response of the devolved administrations if we'd been too hawkish in the guarantee. And the balance, again, that we were striking was between the liabilities that sat with UK government, but the fair issue raised by the devolved administrations, which was their public health responsibilities. And there was a balance to be struck between those two.
Right. I'm about to move on to another topic, so I don't know if it's time for the break, I think.
Remember that we take regular breaks, but I promise you we will finish your evidence this afternoon, Mr. Barclay. I shall return at 3:15.
Okay.
All right. Mr. Wright.
Thank you, my lady. We were going to move on to fiscal flexibility in a pandemic. Now, the devolved administrations have to balance their budgets, is that right, in accordance with fiscal frameworks?
Yes.
Right. And Scotland and Wales, as we understand it, can make use of limited reserves to carry over capital and resource funding, is that right?
That's correct.
And in Northern Ireland, there's a limited ability to carry forward underspend from one year to the next, but up to a pre-defined limit. Is that the background position? Now, that's all part, isn't it, of the usual operation of the Barnett formula?
It is.
Okay. Do you accept that the notification of significant consequentials late in the financial year can present a challenge, either if they're negative or positive, that money may have to be clawed back by the Treasury, and that can affect the ability of the devolved nations to plan accordingly?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, all right. In the pandemic, is this the position that the usual Barnett formula arrangement that you've just confirmed was altered so that the devolved governments were given the flexibility to carry forwards about £2.1 billion of funding from 2020-21 into 21-22? It's from paragraph 30 of your statement.
It was. And Scotland was allowed to carry forward 1.1 billion, Wales 650 million, and Northern Ireland 300 million.
And that was in addition to any existing reserves that they had?
I would have to check whether it's additional or whether that was the total quantum, but that's what they were allowed to carry forward.
Yeah. What was the rationale for allowing them to carry forward that sum of money?
The rationale was there was significant volatility because, as we have already covered, there was very significant increases over the course of the year from what the original budgets had been when they were set before COVID to what, over the course of the year, they had been increased to as a result of dealing with the pandemic. And so the budgets had gone up very significantly for example, the Department of Health or the Department of Transport, or name your pick. All departments had seen significant increases. That had then led to Barnett consequentials for the Scotland Government. As we got to SUPs, supplementary estimates, and the final assessment was made of what had been spent, that would have led to very significant changes for the devolved administrations. And we therefore tried to smooth that, again, as part of our constructive working with the DOs.
And was that decision to allow them to carry forward that funding taken as a one-off decision in consultation with them for that year?
Yes.
Looking ahead, do you consider in time of future emergency that there ought to be an automatic ability for the devolved administrations to carry forward funding, given you can anticipate all of the things you've just dealt with in terms of uncertainty and additional spending might arise again?
Well, the justification was because of the very large volatility and significant increases. That doesn't apply in the same way to business as usual. And I think it's important to point out, my lady, that English departments did not get that same flexibility. Yeah. And so, again, there is a point of fairness in that, as part of our constructive working with the devolved administrations, we allowed them to carry forward underspends in a way that English departments weren't able to do so.
So just so we all understand that, for an English department, there isn't an ability to carry forward underspend, so money that isn't spent effectively is clawed back by the centre, but you made an arrangement with the devolved administrations to allow them to carry forward that money. Now, that was one-off. My question really was, that was a negotiation or a discussion, and you allowed them to carry forwards. In a future time of emergency, would there be a reason for saying, well, we'll cross that bridge if and when we come to it, or so that people know you'll be able to carry it forward, so it's an automatic ability to carry forward?
So at a future time of emergency, I would expect Treasury ministers to look at advice and receive similar advice, perhaps to the advice that we received, because of the size of the sums and the late adjustments. And the recognition was these were very late in the year adjustments of very large sums. But I think it is important to point out, in terms of fairness and whether this should be applied as business as usual, it did mean that the devolved administrations received significantly more in 2021-22 than the equivalent English departments did. So to put that in context, I think David Phillips, page 31 of his report, suggests that it equated to around £200 per person in Scotland and Wales, and around £150 per person higher in Northern Ireland. And that is because the underspends in England came back to the Treasury. And again, I think taxpayers would expect us to do that. We allocated funds to allow the response to the pandemic. But if those funds haven't been spent, you would expect from a taxpayer point of view, those to come back to the Treasury. But we recognise they were very late adjustments for the devolved administrations, which is why we allowed a degree more flexibility.
So was it a timing point then that meant you allowed that flexibility? It was because they were late adjustments, is that the point?
It was both timing and quantum.
I'm sorry, you'll have to explain what you mean by
Well, it was
quantum.
both that so SUPS is February, just going towards the end of the financial year, and also these were very large adjustments. So we had allocated the funding to departments who said they needed it because they were responding at pace. Where they hadn't spent that money, it would have led to very significant adjustments to the devolved administrations who would have said that, well, they had taken decisions in the expectation of that money, and then if we turn around and said we're clawing it back that financial year, that would have created volatility for them, and that's why there was flexibility in terms of carryovers.
But does that same problem not apply to English departments that would have it clawed back?
But we have the discussion and the data is much clearer with English departments in terms of their underspends. We don't have that data in terms of, for example, Scottish local authorities.
Is it right that additional flexibility was sought by the Scottish and Welsh governments, in particular capital to resource switching, so switching monies from one budget to another and increasing the carry forward ability of reserves?
Well, the DAs, perfectly understandable, always would seek more flexibilities, and CDAD to RDL switches is a common request, not just from the DAs.
I'm going to ask that a document is put up from, this is from Rebecca Evans' statement, INQ 000652754. Paragraph 53, 54, 55. And she says at paragraph 55, I wrote to the Chief Secretary on 24th March 2021 to inform him that our plans for 2020-21 as laid out in our third supplementary budget included a switch from revenue DEL to capital DEL of 501 million. I did not receive a response to this letter. As things turned out, we were actually able to increase capital investment by more than expected at the time of the 24th March letter, which required a bigger revenue to capital switch. However, following lengthy discussions between Welsh Treasury officials and HM Treasury officials, we were denied the flexibility to switch additional revenue to capital. This is despite being given to understand that the revenue and capital imbalance could be managed after the year end via an outturn adjustment. Correction to the final figures to reflect the actual rather than expected amounts. Do you recall receiving that letter that she refers to? And if you do, did you respond to it?
Well, 5 years on, I can't recall a individual letter at the peak of the pandemic response. But what I would draw your attention to is if one looks at the same statement at paragraph 68, Rebecca Evans says, and I quote, I do not think I would have done anything differently to prepare the initial economic response to the pandemic from a financial portfolio perspective. And indeed, we covered a little while before the break earlier the guarantee. Rebecca Evans wrote to me requesting the guarantee, which we then put in place 3 weeks later. So we were responding to her letters. The guarantee and the quick response to that illustrates that. And also, if one looks at my readout from my private office of the 18th of March 2020, you will see that a theme of that readout from me to my officials was emphasising the importance of close working with the DAs.
You might not remember the letter, but do you remember the request to switch £501 million in that way?
Well, there are very regular requests for CDL to RDLs, which is in fact, as a former health secretary, one of the major criticisms of the previous Conservative government was too often it made CDL to RDL switches in order quite often to respond to industrial action and respond to pay requests or increasing in staff, which is sometimes at the expense of capital. And indeed, the first budget of this government, I know they switched 600 million CDL to RDL in health as well. So it is a common request. What we tried to do with both the guarantee and with the carry forward was give the devolved administrations sufficient flexibility. And if I could just point to the expert report from David Phillips, what he says in paragraph 10 is, my judgment is that overall with these changes, the funding arrangements for the devolved and local governments allowed them to respond effectively to the COVID-19 pandemic. So there's a range of requests. The measures we took gave, in my view, sufficient flexibility for the DAs to respond effectively. And if one doesn't accept my view on that, that is also the view, and we can go to the statements, of various statements from the DA finance ministers.
I don't think, with respect, that answers my question as to whether you remember this request or not, which is what I asked you. But notwithstanding the answer, why would you have refused that request? Why would the Treasury? I'm just trying to understand the rationale for the Treasury refusing a request like that in a circumstance of pandemic emergency.
Well, there are two different things. I mean, one is paying for buildings, IT, and things that are important from a value for money perspective in the medium term, not least if one opens up a wider discussion around value for money and productivity, then that pertains to the capital budget. The revenue budget is dealing with pay, with staff numbers, with immediate pressures in terms of staff costs, and that should be looked at on its own merits. And that's what we were doing with English departments, and the same applied to the DAs.
I think in 2020-21, the Welsh Government returned 155 million to the Treasury, in part because of the decision not to allow them to switch in that way. Do you accept that?
Yes, but the reduction was several-fold less than that of English departments. So I think, from memory, the reduced underspend in Wales was £50 per person. In England, it was £450. So, again, I just point to the balance between fairness for English departments and those of the DAs.
So I'm just trying to understand your perspective and reasoning in making these decisions. Is it that essentially, yes, you accept that that might have been something that reduced an element of flexibility for the Welsh Government, but as Chief Secretary to the Treasury, you had an obligation to the United Kingdom, all nations, and were trying to ensure that there was equality in terms of spend across them? Is that effectively the position?
Well, I think I'm saying more than that. I'm saying first there's a balance of fairness between the DAs and England-only departments. But second, more directly to your question, if, taken as an example, building work has slowed in Wales because of the pandemic, and therefore some of the capital budget hasn't been spent, but staff costs have increased or revenue costs have increased, then it's a balanced approach to say, as we give more money to deal with the revenue, we should use some of the underspends that have accrued on the capital. Otherwise, you're saying, I want more for part of my budget where the costs have increased, but I want to keep the entirety of another bit of the budget where the costs have decreased. And so those are perfectly common discussions one has with the department. We were having exactly the same discussions with the devolved administrations, but notwithstanding that, the DAs in 2021-2 were in a much more preferential position because of the carry forward per head of funding compared to English departments.
Thank you. So it's about matching funding with the need at the time, essentially.
Yes, and I suspect if we didn't do that, the Treasury would be criticised on value for money grounds.
Can I move on to another subject, please, which is communication and engagement. with the devolved administrations. As Chief Secretary to the Treasury, presumably there were various methods of communicating announcements between Treasury and the devolved administrations. Was one of the forums Forum of Finance Ministers quadrilateral meetings?
It was.
Yeah. And now, pre-pandemic, they'd happen how many times a year? Not precisely, but on average.
It's a long time ago, but I think it was a couple of times a year. It may have been quarterly, but not very frequently.
And during the pandemic, did that frequency significantly increase?
It did.
Yeah. And did you think that was a beneficial forum for you to meet with counterparts?
It was one of a number. So I think it was useful in terms of information sharing, but it sat alongside discussions by the Quad with the First Minister. It sat alongside the then Chancellor Duchy of Lancaster that led on union engagement, because it was led from the Cabinet Office, not from the Treasury. So it was part of a range of communication channels, but also probably the most important actually wasn't at ministerial level, it was at official level. And that's where there was very extensive communication, and that's where I would say it was probably most effective.
Well, why do you think that is, that it's at that level that communication is more effective?
Well, I think because there's political differences at the political level, and sometimes information can enter the public domain in a way that one hopes is less so at official level.
Did the pace of the response to the pandemic, the speed at which government was having to react, present challenges in terms of keeping the devolved administrations up to speed with funding announcements that were going to be made and levels of funding?
Yes, it did.
Yeah. I mean, just to take an example that comes from Kate Forbes, the Scottish Government. She gives an example. I'll just give you the example. 11th of March 2020, a £30 billion package of economic support. So there would be consequential Scottish Government funding. 14th of March, Scots Government announced how they'd spend the money. 17th of March, UK governments increased that package to 330 billion. So that gives you a sense of the speed at which things were happening and the scale of developments. I don't raise that as a complaint, but just really for your view. Is there anything you can do about that in the context of a pandemic emergency or any fast-paced emergency?
Well, firstly, English departments were also often dealing with a fast move. So again, I wouldn't say this is a particular issue to the DAs. And secondly, you cited Kate Forbes. You know, I just referenced paragraph 15 of her statement, in which she particularly talks about the constructive relationship she had with both chief secretaries. So there was a very strong desire, certainly on my part, and I think on my successor's part, to work closely with the devolved administrations. And Ms. Forbes cites that in her statement, as does Conor Murphy, who says the relationship was productive, as indeed does Rebecca Evans.
Please don't misunderstand my question. I'm not suggesting for a moment there wasn't constructive engagement. What I'm asking you is, really, given the speed at which the pandemic was developing, people may point out these sorts of difficulties, but was there anything that you could practically have done about it?
Well, as I mentioned in my first evidence session, it was not uncommon for Treasury officials to be working through the night, given the pace at which decisions were required. And so, obviously, when teams within the Treasury are under that time pressure, the amount of time between resolving a course of action and communicating that gets truncated.
I'm just going to ask that an observation of your successor, I think Simon Clarke, could be put up, please. INQ 0058 7359, paragraph 88. This is on the issue of engagement. His reflection was we could potentially have better managed the relationship by having had more meetings where we worked at a ministerial level, perhaps a few days or hours earlier, to try and discuss the contours of the support packages which were available, that this would not have changed the Treasury's decisions something that could have been done purely to manage the relationship. And he goes on, there was relentless pressure on time. So managing relationships simply could not always be the first priority during a crisis like the COVID pandemic. Picking up that last point, this obviously was an extremely pressured time. Do you share his reflection that there could have been more engagement, or do you, and you've to a sense touched on this, take the view that there simply wasn't time for further engagement and it wasn't actually that productive given the speed at which things were developing?
Well, firstly, I think there's different phases of the pandemic and different circumstances. I think David Phillips, for example, notes there was very good engagement in the early phase of the pandemic, but suggests where that became more strained was not because of a lack of engagement, but because of a difference of view in terms of what the public health measures should be. As I say, the Treasury engagement was one of a number of forums in which discussions will be held with the DAs. So, for example, through COBRA, there would be discussions. And there are also balances in terms of particularly market-sensitive information. And we saw that, if I just take this week's coverage of the budget, in which the front page of the Times suggested members of the Cabinet may not have been cited on aspects of the latest budget. So there were always challenges around market-sensitive information. I think at official level, there was very good engagement between the Treasury and their counterparts in the devolved administrations. And certainly on a personal level, it's something I put significant value on. But often the timing was tight because of the pressures people were and the deadlines people were working to.
Thank you. In 2022, we understand that there was a review of intergovernmental relations with the devolved governments, and the Finance Minister's quadrilateral was replaced by a new organisation, the Interministerial Standing Committee. Now, I'm not sure if you left your role by then.
I wasn't in the Treasury then.
No, exactly. Are you familiar with that new committee and how it operates? Or if you're not, I won't ask you anything about it.
No.
No. All right. Thank you. I'll leave it there. Just one question then about official level engagement. I just want to give you an opportunity to comment on this, given you've raised official level engagement. Could we have up, please, INQ 000 653414? This is part of Kate Forbes' statement, paragraph 15. I think this is the paragraph you referred to. And there we are. The one observation I would make, which I mentioned in my oral evidence in Module 2A, was that the devolved finance officials were very seldom cited on what the UK government might be about to do financially. So in meetings, they would give us their best evidence, and they would speak honestly and truthfully when they said no further funding would be provided. Then sometimes as quickly as 24 hours later, additional funding would be announced. This was largely because officials did not know. It was down to a breakdown in communication between UK government and the Treasury devolved officials, rather than a breakdown between Treasury devolved officials and the Scottish government. I mean, do you recognise that problem and accept it, or not?
No, I don't. And as I say, I think one can look at specific examples of very good close working. So one example was the legislation, the COVID response bill, in which I think there was evidence of very close working across the DAs and the UK government. I pointed to the independent findings of David Phillips, who has commented on both the UK government and the DAs highlighted improved intergovernment communication in the early stages of the COVID pandemic. That's page 12 of his report. So I think there are a number of areas where one can point to good working relations, as you mentioned, in Ms. Forbes' own statement. she says that, but so does Conor Murphy, so does other finance ministers. But of course, it was a time when people were working at significant pace and challenge. And I'm sure if one were to speak to Secretary of State of English departments, they would also have often liked more notice on decisions. But the Quad itself was taking evidence in real time based on the scientific evidence that they were receiving. So there was a pressure on time.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Barclay, those are the topics I wanted to cover with you, but to give you an opportunity, do you have any observations or reflections, having managed these relationships, that could be carried forward in terms of any future emergency? Or have we covered the learning that you think there is to be drawn from what happened in the pandemic?
I think you've covered them extremely effectively.
Thank you. Those are my questions. Thank you very much. I don't think there are any other questions.
There are no other questions. Mr. Barclay, thank you very much indeed. That completes the questions we have for you. I know that it's a burden to ask witnesses to come once, let alone to come more than once like you've had to do. And so thank you very much for the help you've given to the inquiry.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Very well. Is that it for today?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
10 o'clock tomorrow, please.
All right.